Well, welcome back to Paris. Let's actually start by bringing you up to date on the situation in a neighbouring country, in Belgium in fact, where police have carried out some half a dozen raids in the Brussels area in connection with the Paris attacks. It's believed the raids are linked to Bilal Hadfi, who's been identified as one of the suicide bombers at the Stade de France. An unidentified official quoted by the AP, the Associated Press news agency, says the raids are centred on his so-called entourage. Meanwhile here in Paris, politicians debating whether to extend the state of emergency, those powers that were invoked. These live pictures from the Parliament where that debate is taking place. It's essentially, we expect, pretty much a rubber stamping exercise. The French Prime Minister addressed the debate earlier, saying there's a risk that terrorists could use chemical weapons and implored his colleagues to approve a 3-month extension of the state of emergency, which amongst other things gives police and security forces new and special powers. Well, joining us from central London to discuss how much and to what extent life has changed for the people of France is the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. Nabila Ramdani, a very good morning to you. Let's just start with this question of emergency powers. It was striking yesterday, looking at those pictures from Saint-Denis, to see the specially trained police officers, but shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, with infantrymen. It was a mark of how things on the ground are changing here. We've got a report from the Agence France-Presse as well, suggesting, it's only from the AFP at this stage, but suggesting that off-duty police officers will be allowed to take their weapons home for their personal protection. Things are changing.
Yes, very much so. And I have to say, I spoke to a lot of people in Saint-Denis yesterday, and they very much said that it felt like being in a war zone. You don't expect to see gunfights and indeed explosions in Greater Paris. And yet that's exactly what happened. And as it did happen on Friday night as well. And we've heard as well from the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who said to the French people that they effectively have to get used to that kind of warfare in central Paris because of ongoing threats and the ongoing crisis that is unfolding. But I can tell you that's not, particularly what the French would like to hear. And of course, the French government has to take the situation extremely seriously. But it's one thing to, carry out attacks, on foreign land, Syria, Iraq, or indeed in Mali, as the French government did a few months ago. But it's quite another. These are the kind of foreign adventures that the French people can distance themselves from. But when it happens at home, it's a quite different affair.
But the police, I'm sure, would say they had absolutely no choice. These were heavily armed individuals. They needed to apprehend them. The fact that they elected to fight back expending, it's believed, something like 5,000 bullets in the process, the authorities would say that wasn't their choice. They'd simply gone to arrest these people. The fact they fought back was their choice.
Well, absolutely. And I can tell you, I've been speaking to a lot of people in Paris, including my own family, and the overwhelming feeling at the moment is one of grief, anger, but also of fear. And there is no doubt that, the French would welcome anything that would make them feel safe. But it has also to be said that the mood in Paris has changed dramatically. It's very easy to pretend that Paris is a gung-ho, aggressive city that buys into the war narrative, but it really isn't. Paris is a rather gentle, liberal city where people tend to get on and are very tolerant. And, that's one of the reasons why, after experiencing barbaric events like these, it's very difficult for the French to cope with the situation. We've had 2 monstrosities in 1 year, and a lot of people are wondering when the next one will be. And of course, people have tried, to express their feelings by gathering, and that is in spite of them not being allowed to do so, precisely because of the state of emergency measures, which prevents them from getting together. But when they did get together, it was and it was not unusual to see scenes of chaos when bangers went on Sunday night, for example. People started running around the Place de la République, and that sums up the mood of the country at the moment.
Yeah, Nabila, we've talked to you many times down the years about on related subjects. I know we've discussed the question of the veil, the banning of the veil. I remember being in here not far from where I stand now, 10 years ago, thereabouts, when the veil was first banned, and there were big marches organised by Muslim groups in opposition to that. Why, in your view, does France seem to have become a particular target? Is it because it is a beacon of secularism, taking the action, for instance, on the veil that it took, with a vigorous culture of free speech exemplified most obviously by what Charlie Hebdo says and does? Or is there something else going on? I mean, for instance, yesterday we were looking at live pictures from a mayoral conference at which the mayor of Paris was addressing people. Francois Hollande was up on the stage. As the camera swept around, there was something like maybe 2,000 delegates. I think I counted one non-white face there. To what extent is this a story of alienation? To what extent is this France having to reap the whirlwind of being a standard bearer for secularism throughout the world?
Well, Colin, I think it's a combination of several things, and dare I say, perhaps a more direct connection with what's happened in France is France's foreign policy at the moment in the Middle East, and not least of all, its bombing raid in Syria. And I have to say that the kind of language of war that the government is currently using effectively making more raids.
That linkage, but Nabila, that linkage we get with foreign policy, people listen to that, but they say, well, hang on, there are other countries who are involved in that coalition of powers that are bombing IS targets who are not facing the kind of terror on the streets that the French are facing. There has to be something else going on that's nothing to do with French foreign policy and raids over IS targets in Syria and Iraq. It's beyond that, it's more than that.
Well, absolutely. I think that's the trigger, but the long term, or the background story, if you like, is really France's relationship with its ethnic minority communities, which is not, a good one, it has to be said. And you see that in the background, dare I say, of the perpetrators of such horrific attacks. They invariably come from a French North African background, troubled background, often involved in petty criminality, but then get involved in more serious crimes, including charges of terrorism. They often have spent time in prison, and indeed, as we now know, a lot of the terrorists behind the latest attacks have indeed been arrested by the police. Even the government had been aware of them going away on trips to countries like Syria or indeed Yemen, or intending to do so. They have been on a watch list by the government, and yet they seem to have been able to acquire guns with ease and indeed carry out such atrocities. Another thing that is noticeable is because of this kind of poor relationship between France and its minority communities, the result, the direct result, is that the authorities cannot get good intelligence, precisely because they do not interact with Muslim communities, for example, something that the British do pretty well. There is a connection, with criminal gangs and indeed ethnic minorities that can provide good intelligence to prevent that kind of barbaric events.
Yeah. Nabila, one final thought really. Reflect, if you would, on the words of Manuel Valls, your Prime Minister this morning, who has raised the spectre of chemical weapons potentially being used by terrorists. I mean, on one level it's a statement of the obvious, but people will say, but look at the timing, just ahead of trying to invoke an extension of emergency powers. Politicians are damned if they do, damned if they don't, aren't they? Because on the one hand, yes, he may be using this as a way of getting that vote through, but also he's got a responsibility as an elected politician whose first responsibility is to keep his people safe, to remind people how high the stakes are. He may, of course, be privy to intelligence that we haven't seen. He has a duty and a responsibility to let people know what dangers they face.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think the government made it very clear that, there will be further raids, for example, and there will be further threats to the country. And I think the French people now know that the country is not safe, really. But I think this kind of language is also quite chilling. It contributes to the atmosphere of chaos and indeed panic And you can see that in day-to-day life, restaurants and cafes and indeed other businesses are shunned. And, in the run-up to Christmas, this doesn't bode well, for the festive atmosphere. And I think, the country has not been in great shape economically under the socialist government. And this is going to not only affect the situation as far as security is concerned, but also economically.
Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much indeed.